Good afternoon, and welcome to the, I guess it's the fourth sessions for today for the PGVIS 2022, day 3. And together with us here, we have Professor Peter Tornquist, Dean of the Untitled Conservatory of Music, National University of Singapore, together with us. He just arrived this morning, and thank you for joining us straight from the airport. As a composer, Professor Peter Tornquist grew up in Sweden and Switzerland and Brazil, and he has been an active voice in political and organization aspect of Norwegian society throughout his career. He was a president of ISCM and a vice chairman of Norwegian Composer Association, and he's already has repeatedly been elected for public office at local and regional levels. And as a principal of Norwegian Academy of Music since 2013, he has contributed to the development of higher music education through a widening network of strategic national and international partnerships. And he has been awarded honorary fellowships by the Guildhall School of Music and Drama and the Royal Norton College of Music in recognition for his service to music. And today he's here together with us in Southeast Asian region, and we are very much looking forward to the change he will bring to this region. So here, Shaping the Future, Challenges and Opportunities in Higher Music Education by Professor Peter Tornquist from Untitled Conservatory.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, and I have been given the honor of removing my mask, but I can assure you I have every sort of vaccine. And in Singapore they say that it's now a bigger danger of getting dengue than getting COVID because everybody has had it. So, and dengue doesn't transmit this way. Anyway, very good to have you here and very good to be here. As Anatai said, I am just now the new Dean of Untitled Conservatory in Singapore. I've been there half a year, so it's quite recent, and my background before that is in Europe, more particularly in Norway and Sweden and many other countries. The title of this talk is Shaping the Future, even though the title of the conference is commemorating now. This is because I very much, through my experience of looking at higher music education, so conservatories and universities and departments of music all over the world, I'm starting, or have started to see some patterns about how music and society interact and how we need to respond to that as conservatories of music. So essentially this talk is to students, to future students, but also to teachers and leaders in the sector. It's a little bit of a mix, and I'll try to bring all of that. Of course, I bring my major hat, which is being a dean of a conservatory and trying to understand what sort of world we are dealing with. And it should come as no surprise that we are living in a very complex and uncertain world right now. The pandemic has been unprecedented in the last 100 years. We came out of the pandemic into a war in Europe. There's a big energy crisis. There is a big climate crisis. There are a lot of things going on. Social scientists have actually coined a word for this, which is the Vuca World. Vuca standing for a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. So this is actually a characteristic of all of those words on the screen. And the Vuca world is, it sounds almost frightening, you say, seeing that something is uncertain and complex and ambiguous. It is not unprecedented. We have been in this situation before in human history. And very broadly speaking, there are some reasons for this uncertainty, mainly that we are experiencing an historic phase of transition. We are transitioning between what used to be known states, one of them being the world order. Now, this is very simple, very simplistic. No social scientist would agree, but this actually comes from one of them, seeing that broadly speaking, the last 250 years, we have lived, and this applies specifically here in Southeast Asia, we have lived under a situation where there was a Dutch world order, which was replaced by a British world order that eventually got replaced by an American world order. And at the time of this graph, it's like 10 years ago, so China was rising as the new Chinese world order. Well, this is more complex now than it looked back 10 years ago. But definitely, we can say that the American world order that came into being after Second World War, it has peaked, it is declining, and something is coming up, but it's not as simple as simply saying that China is coming up, because China is facing this other issue, which also is something about transition. And if you don't know this, this is simply a chart of how many people existed in the world in 1950, and how many of them were like children, younger children, adolescents, people working, and old people. This is how a good pyramid should look like. A lot of children, good chunk of people actually doing the work, and few elders so these can actually take care of them. Yeah? What happened in 2010 is that, as you know, and this is a situation also in Southeast Asia, we have far fewer children, and those who were children here, 60 years later, they are all like in working class. Problem is that by 2050, they will all be retired, not working anymore. And this is something, for instance, China is facing as one of its biggest challenges. China is actually going to shrink. And this is not guesswork. This is actually just looking at how many people, how many children are there in Singapore, in Thailand, in China, in all of the countries. So this is also something that is changing. We need to deal with it. Finally, there's another change, another shift that has been going on since 1700s. The Industrial Revolution used to be what we knew as, mechanization, steam power. Then it created assembly lines, motor cars. That was called Industry 2.0. Industry 3.0 came in the 60s with computers. We are now facing Industry 4.0, which is what everybody is talking about now. It's cyberspace, internet, networks. And have a look at the timeline. It took 100 years to go from Industry 1 to Industry 2. 100 years. Another 100 years to get into Industry 3. But only 50 years into Industry 4. And already we are facing a lot of intelligent people talking about Industry 5.0, which means that the pace of change is increasing as we witness this. And Industry 5.0 is moving even beyond the automation of Industry 4, but also includes issues like sustainability and the demographics. This is all to show that the world is changing. The world as we know is changing very much. And in a world that is volatile, that is uncertain, that is complex and ambiguous, how are we preparing students not only to survive, but to actually shape the music industry of tomorrow? That is a big question I face myself with every morning I wake up. How on earth do we actually prepare a younger generation for a future that we actually don't know much about? And I'm not talking about the future of what's happening next year, but I'm talking about the future of when our students or young people today will be facing in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We don't have a clue about how music industry is going to be. We know or we assume a lot of things, but do remember that 15 years ago, and that's not very long in historical terms, we had no idea about the iPhone, about Spotify, about Facebook, about Instagram, about almost everything that we take for granted today. And that has changed the music industry quite significantly. So this is a big conundrum, and I'm going to unpack some of the possible answers to this. Very generally speaking, there are some traits about what would be considered a stable world and a changing world. And remember that this is not uncommon. History has always had phases of transition, and phases of stability. In the phase of stability, we see specialists developing. People very specialized in one thing. In a changing world, we see generalists, people who are able to do many things. In a stable world, we talk about tactics. In an unstable world or changing world, strategy becomes more important. In a stable world, quantity matters. How many of you have heard that you need to practice 10,000 hours a day? Yeah, that used to be what our teachers told us because that was common knowledge 20 years ago. Today we speak about, it's not the number of hours, it's the quality of your practicing that matters. Typical trait of a changing world. Deliberate practice, which is narrowing a problem until you find a solution, versus problem solving, which is looking at wider circles of knowledge. Interpretation analysis versus improvisation and intuition. You like that, Cast? It's good for you. Very interestingly, in a stable world, we spend a lot of time looking at where we came from, history. In a changing world, we are much more engaged in the future, where we are going. Just a few other examples. Education is considered a goal, getting a university degree, for instance, or finishing secondary school. In a changing world like today, education is a way of getting something. Institutions have been perceived as authorities. Today, institutions are more perceived as services. You can shop around. One of the reasons we have many online experiences. I won't go through all of them, but you will probably, everyone here above the age of 40 will recognize that phone and TV used to be a communication we knew, whereas today chat and social media are much more preferred. We could go on, newspapers, fixed versus online, and so on and so on. Finally, back when I started, being in leadership, replying by the next day would be okay. Today, actually, all students expect a response 24/7. It's the fear of missing out. All of this is explained, or a lot of this is explained by the fact of the world being in change. So nothing of this is unexpected or uncommon. But what are the consequences for the three main groups that I'm concerned with here? We should be concerned as musicians. So students, audience, musicians, what responses can we see? What dilemmas, what issues would be interesting to look at? I'll try to unpack these. Take students, for instance. We can typically say today that students are digital natives, certainly much more than my generation. We know that students will be living longer, and they are better educated, far better educated than any of the previous generations, and have access to much more information. But being digital native does not mean that every student is digitally literate, meaning being actually able to, for instance, code a website or take part in that side of the economy. The vast majority of music students may be able to work computers and Sibelius, and that's, or a sequencer, but still not digitally literate. Students may be living longer, but are also having to face a much longer professional life. The majority of students graduating from a conservatory today will still be professionally active in 2071, which is a lot. We won't, yeah? And that's changing. So having to work until you are 70, 75, it's not uncommon. Will be even less common. Better educated, yes, but needing more frequent retraining to stay relevant. And this is explained by the following graph. This is a graph that explains something called the half-life of knowledge. Again, social scientists doing their work. Half-time of knowledge, it tries to plot how long time does it take before the knowledge that you learned about something is actually half as relevant. Yeah? So you see here that school knowledge, what you're learning, actually stays quite long. It's fundamental stuff. 20 years, you still be using the knowledge you learned at school. University knowledge, though, actually 50% of it's considered to be gone by 10 years. Yeah? And this is like university knowledge. Professional expertise actually decays very much quickly. Technology knowledge, or IT expertise, and for those of you who have been around for a few years, you may remember that the stuff we learned about technology in the 90s or early 2000s, well, those programs are not around anymore. It's not that it's completely gone, you haven't lost it, but the value of it is halved. Which simply means, and this is a big issue now for universities worldwide, it simply means that the generation of young people today, students of today, will need to come back and retrain and learn new skills. And some countries, and a place like Singapore is doing this very methodically, actually expecting 100,000 students to come into universities fresh every year. That is a fifth of the workforce of Singapore coming back to university every 5 years. So that's the goal. This is all has to do with the half-life of knowledge. This does not apply to something like learning to play the violin or the piano, because you learn that, you still have to practice, but you won't forget it. But it's all the other stuff, the new stuff, not the basic stuff, but the stuff that actually makes you professionally relevant. So this is an interesting picture of where students stand today. Digital natives, but not necessarily fully digitally literate, living longer but having to work longer, better educated but actually having to face retraining to stay relevant. Remember, we don't know how music industry will develop, so we can't actually give you especially not in 4 years of a bachelor degree. Audiences, a slightly similar thing. We can definitely see that audiences today they are still there. And I can tell you this with good authority that there will always be an audience for music. There has never been a bigger audience for music than today. And this includes classical music. It includes symphony orchestra. Christoph, you were just saying about filling the Esplanade in Singapore with 1,800 people. Yes, it happens. It happens almost everywhere. We are able to do it. And no, the audience is not necessarily only older people, although they are still listening. So more people will be listening. And we also know they are connected. They are online. But then again, the majority of the audience, they are definitely not digital natives. Once the younger generation grows up and becomes... But remember, the younger generation is the smallest part of the pyramid. The biggest part is in the middle, people my age. And 20 years on, Carsten and I, we will be on the top of the pyramid. Very costly retirees. But we may be digital natives, but the majority of our audience is not. They're aging. Hang on, this went wrong direction. One more. They're aging, but they are living longer and healthier lives, which is also interesting, which means we'll have an audience which is actually older, but still active, even if they are 90, 100 years. They're open-minded. We know this, and I'll give you an example very quickly. But they're less loyal to brands and traditions. So they might be listening to a symphony orchestra one week, but they are more than likely to be listening to Elton John in their car on the way home. You know? And this is a trait that has become more and more clear as we look into audiences. Finally, they are interested, but they are far more eclectic and less, I say connoisseur, but less like knowledgeable about one tradition. So even the Mozart overture that we spoke about tonight might not be something they ever heard before, which was unthinkable 1 generation ago. There was a smaller audience attending symphony orchestras, but they knew their stuff. This is not necessarily true. And how do I know this? Yeah, well, Spotify, I mentioned Spotify. It's one of the biggest listening platforms today. It's the biggest streaming platform and has the biggest number of tracks in it, the biggest number of users. Every user, a typical user of Spotify, has an account. And a typical account, remember that Spotify has been around for 15 years now. So a typical account of Spotify, and there is data about this, I'm going to show you this, has around 10,000 tracks in it. Yeah, sounds a lot, but look at your own phones, you'll see that it's not far off. And there are tools to actually analyze this data. This is one of them. So I've just accessed a typical Spotify playlist, and these tools are online. They are free, actually from Spotify themselves. Looking at how this works and which tracks are played more often, and believe me, record companies work a lot with this sort of data. I've narrowed into this little list, which is genres. On this particular playlist, this particular account on Spotify, you can see that, okay, so on this playlist, jazz, cool jazz, and vocal jazz are very high up. Jazz classical comes here, very good, classical, but then rock comes almost as big. Classical performance, classic rock comes also quite high. Early music, good. We can see some good signs. But early music next to bossa nova. Yeah? And then Baroque, and then, what do we have here? Contemporary classic. This is a very interesting new genre. But it comes straight next to avant-garde and ambient and freak folk. Oh, God. That's a genre. Progressive rock, folk, indie rock, classic Canadian rock. Gosh. What else do we have? Metal next to choral. And this is ranked, these are the 30th biggest genres in this playlist. Yeah? Now, so that's the first bit of news. These are only the 30th most common genres on this particular playlist. The other bit of news is that this is not any playlist. This is actually my playlist. This is my Spotify account. Canadian, I have to check it. I don't know. And I honestly don't think metal, okay, I may have thought. But the thing is that if this represents my playlist, and I'm about as much, elite establishment as they come. I'm the dean of a conservatory. I'm classically trained composer. I'm in my 50s, white, male, European. You don't get anything more classical oriented than this package. And I'm listening to all of this. What do you expect your audiences to be listening to? It's a lot more wide and eclectic than this. I think the reason for metal is that I do some running, and occasionally I have some metal coming out there. But this reflects, actually, this is quite interesting, actually. So this is apparently what I recently played. So I was out running yesterday. I clearly was, I don't know what wood cabin, this is some soft. The other day I was repotting my plants, so I needed some electronica plant music. Coldplay is cool, I like it, and this is classical music. And of course I was doing dinner, so I had to relax and unwind. There you go. You see, this is how we consume music today. And this is how I, as a very traditional, very mainstream, classical dean have in my playlist. This was actually shocking the first time I saw it, but it tells us a lot about the diversity of our audience. And thankfully, musicians are responding to this. Musicians have already seen this trend, and by musicians, I'm now referring to musicians more in the sense of music makers. So musicians, performers, composers, producers, record companies. Let me just, I can put this up here as well. There is a lot of reinvention going on today of venues, formats, expressions, interpretations, repertoire, masterpieces, reimagining and even recomposing a lot of this tradition that we take for granted. I'll just give you some examples to put this into perspective. You may have heard this. This is, of course, not Vivaldi, but it is Vivaldi. It is, of course, not modern music. Yeah, I mean, you can all hear it's clearly, based on Baroque music, but it is modern music. It's Max Richter, it's film composer, reimagining Vivaldi. And this is huge on YouTube and on Spotify. This piece alone has more listeners than the majority of symphony orchestra recordings on Spotify. And this, to the point of this actually now being programmed in symphony orchestras around the world, because it has become a new hit. But is it new music? Is it old music? Is it Vivaldi? No, doesn't matter. But this actually relates to the, taste of an audience, because it's a mix of very interesting things. It's reimagining, recomposing. A completely different example. It's so beautiful that it breaks my heart to stop it. This is another interesting example. This is a piece by Couperin. It's called Le Barricade Mystérieuse, a very well-known piece for cembalo. But suddenly we have two of the hottest young performers in the early music creating something that is not Couperin. Couperin never ever intended this piece to be performed on cembalo and the lute. And if I played the rest of it, you would see that they go slightly off-piste on this. And it sounds wonderful. It's gorgeous. It's new creation. It's reimagining tradition in a way that the composer would never have thought of. And this is even not using technology, as Max Richter was on the violin. It's just the old lute and the cembalo, but they are reimagining it. And surprise, surprise, this is big hit. This is a recording that, is selling copies as a pop recording, was pop rock. And these guys also very, very well known. Okay, we have time for this also. Hopefully.
We have been trying to search for kind of a parallel universe in the score.
Rauschendes Bächlein so silbern und hell, eilst zur Geliebten so munter und schnell. Ach, trautes Bächlein, mein Boot sei du, bringe die Grüße des Fernani zu. All ihre Blumen im Garten gepflegt.
As classical musicians, we are of course trained to do every bit of information that we get in the score. Every note, every rhythm, every chord, every dynamics that is there, we have to do. But at one point, we just thought that what will happen, what kind of interpretation space will we find if we allow a larger portion of our musicality to come through? What will happen to the songs of Schwangesang when we just say that everything is allowed?
For instance, in Amer, this is original Schubert. And what kind of associations do we get from this? Okay, it's more like if you add some rhythm here, and maybe then we've moved, I don't know, maybe 100 years forward in time, and maybe to the United States or something. So it's very close to Schubert, but still totally different universe, and And then this makes us going in one direction, and it ends up in a, yeah, very similar to Schubert, but also very different.
Das Meer erglänzt weit hinaus im letzten Abendschein.
In der Ferne,
Okay, this again, this would be completely okay and normal if these were jazz musicians and a pop singer. This happens to be the head of piano and the head of voice in a major conservatory in Europe. Yeah? They are experimenting, as I say, what would happen if we did this? And interestingly, this probably sounds much more like the idea of what Schubert had in his head, because he was actually, we know that this wasn't like, bel canto. It was much more of what today would be singer-songwriter, of course, in that tradition. But they are challenging, they are experimenting, they are saying that we love this tradition, but let's bring it somewhere else. And this is something musicians are doing. I could play you even more examples, but they are all over the place. So in the interest of time, I'll just move on. But this idea of reinventing, reimagining, and recomposing is a response. And if you may remember my chart about the stable world and the changing world, this is very much a symptom of a changing world where we try to find new ways of looking at history, looking at the future, not looking back, looking forward. This brings me to a statement that is actually the conclusion of this talk, and that I keep reminding myself of very much, again, every day. The music industry is changing fast. Being an excellent performer, while still critical, is no longer sufficient. Music makers of tomorrow need to master multiple roles: performing, creating, curating, producing, leading, managing, teaching, communicating, and other roles yet to be imagined. This is nothing new again, because if you look at the time of Mozart, every musician did all of this. So again, transition and stability. But the 21st century musician, I'm increasingly starting to define them as a multi-dimensional artists. They need to be proficient at multiple roles, but excellent at more than one. And this is important in the way we train young musicians today, understanding that proficiency at just playing the piano or just composing or just conducting will no longer cut it. And more likely than not, students will need to come back and develop excellency in new areas as and when the industry develops. I have come up with 3 necessary steps that I use to sort of think about how to do this. Creating spaces for students in conservatories and music departments to experiment safely and freely, experiment being one of the words. Creating spaces for peer learning. We know that students in a conservatory learn around 50% of their knowledge comes from learning from each other, which is exactly the same in an orchestra. Yeah? And by the way, Cast being here, Cast is a recent hire to the Young Conservatory. He's been brought in exactly to create a space of experimentation. We have to create spaces for interdisciplinarity, where musicians work together with theater, with visual arts, with dance, in a very natural way. I know you do hear this here. And we need to create spaces for multiple competencies. So more likely than not, having a double major will be a normal situation in the future. And we already see many examples of students coming to conservatories and saying that, I happen to be very interested in playing classical saxophone, but I'm also very good at jazz saxophone. And traditionally we have told them, you have to choose. No, play classic piano and jazz piano. This will be a typical situation of actually doing both in the future, more and more. We need to create the space for that. We also need to connect globally far more than we do. And connecting globally means creating a truly international environment where we actually learn from each other, because music is so international that the benchmarking that happens when we create an international mix is absolutely crucial. We need to create joint online curricula with strategic partner institutions, because we cannot any longer say that, PGVIM, YST, Mahidol, we do everything. No, we can't. There will be other schools who are better at delivering. If it's jazz theory or conducting, we need to create a space for that, which also means creating a digital infrastructure that enables that. You seem to be having a good start here. And finally, and this is very important, we need to nurture curiosity in our students. Remember that in a stable world, it's drilling down, lots of practicing, narrowing, that's what will make you happy. In a changing world is, lateral thinking, problem solving, expanding your mind. Exploring technology in the classroom and on the stage. Exploring a wide range of artistic methods, not only performing or composing, but actually performing, arranging, transcribing, researching, curating, preparing for all these roles, so students can find their niche. And I've done this experiment at Yonshuto, actually looking at the students in year 4, and they all have at least 3 areas they really like. And then that's okay, because they do have that, and we need to encourage that. Finally, we need to promote critical reflection. We need to promote asking why much more than how to. The how to has been the traditional way of teaching music. You play your 4th finger here, you relax, then everything works. This isn't, of course it has to be there, but we also need this extra level of asking why more often than how. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
That was extremely precise, and every single word matters. So thank you so much. It's
And I'm on time.
Really, on time as well.
On time also,
it's
yeah.
just amazing. Just to share one thing, I'm really excited that I can see the Fantasia list is also on my Spotify list.
There you
we
go.
have something in common.
Yeah.
So just one thing, in your last slide, if you don't mind sharing that, just very quickly, I realized that there are a lot of things, if you don't mind me, if I can jump to the question first. I have a feeling there are a lot of things that we are trying to do here, but the first and foremost is so important to have the space where students can experiment safely and freely. And this is not easy.
It's not easy at all.
It's not easy at all. Especially, if I can be frank, it's not to create a space that is safe and free. You need a lot of understanding from the people around. How do you see that? How do you deal with that? I think this is the foremost important. I'm sorry.
There are many ways of creating spaces in a department of music or in a conservatory or in a school or university, but we can talk about actual physical spaces. You know, creating this sort of space is also important because it enables the rest. But first and foremost, it's a mental mindset of imagining that we cannot control every single aspect of what a student does. And I can tell you that no single teacher in a conservatory, not a single one, knows exactly what the students do from Monday to Friday. We all imagine that we all imagine that they practice and do the homework for our subject. The reality is that it's much more complex, and they are doing far more things, thankfully. But we need to nurture that and create that space, which also means that in timetabling, scheduling, and curriculum. The curriculum itself needs to be, we talk a lot about decolonizing the curriculum. That's important, especially in the States and Europe, because here it has a different, actually, meaning. But the most important thing about curriculum is to declutter it. You know, take away a lot of the things that we think are important, because we are desperate about our students leaving us in 4 years. And look at this dangerous world out there, you know. We need to give them lots of courses and modules. No. We need to make them be able to reinvent themselves, and hopefully they will actually come back in 5 years.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this presentation. Love the thought process of it. And sorry for reflecting a bit longer to get to my actual question. You mentioned that the stable world and the changing world. I personally do believe with many people that we lived in an illusion of a stable world, and we were happy to have actually an exceptionally stable world for the last 40, 50 years, but that was the exception in global history. I started studying at university in '92, which in the height of the stable world phase, if you want to say so, but with a syllabus that was still created in an unstable, changing world, because in Austria, things to change take always longer. So it was the old syllabus, which just to reflect on it, is music. There was no such thing as a bachelor. You either go for masters or you don't, and the masters of music is 8 years. And if you add on a double degree on pedagogy, it's 9 years, which I did. So unimaginable nowadays that you spend 9 years in university or you don't have a degree. Yet, that was exactly coming out of the idea what you said, to have space to experiment. Even at my generation, we knew that only 3% of us will ever get a job in an orchestra, if we are lucky. So most of us will start teaching, having different and various jobs, or be freelancers. So universities created also the space for us to have an excuse to tell the world, no, we are doing something, right? Because there is an aspect of music making that is very often forgotten, is it's not only education, it's skill. And skill is by observing, by learning from each other, by doing. And you cannot stand on your own for this tight market it was, without having developed that skill. Naturally, nowadays, we are the boomers, right? So we had much more competition than the students now have. There were more students, by far, at least in Central Europe, than there are now. So the competition was bigger for a smaller market, in a way.
In a way, yeah.
But in creating the space now with pressures to have now 3 years bachelor's and 1.5 year masters and maybe a doctorate adding on in another year, what is your thought process on that? Actually, creating space means also creating time for a student.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And time that is on not in time by decluttering the syllabus so that they have more time to develop, but actually creating longer-lasting degrees.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and we could go on forever on this. I don't think the answer is going back to the old model, where and remember that before that, music education was something you started actually at 11 years old. 12 years old, that's when you got into a conservatory, and then you spent 10 years there before you got kicked out. But that was tended to be the usual, not only music, but that was how education happened. There's a reason for why this has changed, and some of these reasons have to do with the sheer number of people getting university degrees. So you say the competition was higher in our time, yes, but remember that if you look at Europe as a market, or the US, the number of home students is much less today. But they suddenly have an influx of students coming from China, from Korea, from Russia, not anymore, but so in actual terms, the competition is even fiercer today. And universities are facing a crush on finances and actually space, just to get them through. This would be a problem if we accepted that a university education, or any education, be it professional or academic, is something you do when you are 20 and that's it. It's no longer the case. You do your basic training, but you are likely, very likely, to pivot at least 2 times in your career. And you will need retraining. So I'm much more in favor of the professional education model, where we will allow, and I'm quite sure already in my time as Dean of Yonshudo Conservatory, I will see more 30 and 40 years olds on the classrooms, statistically speaking, than the 20 years olds, because they are coming back. And this is a phenomenon everywhere. Maybe not in Austria yet, but it is. But there you go, yeah. So I think this is the answer, you know, shorter thing, but that said, I don't believe in the idea of doing bachelor's, master's, and a doctorate in 5 years. That's too short.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation, very intriguing in your introduction of the Vuca world, but my question is the world really unpredictable? We've known for the longest time that climate change and global warming is real. It's just that we don't know how to stop, or we don't have the will or the willingness to do it, right? There's the rise of autocrats everywhere and despots, right? There's a mistrust of intellectualism and the rise of fake news, right? There's worsening poverty and hunger everywhere, and the gap between the rich and the poor is wider than ever before. So what is the role now of, and this is a sincere question, how do we prepare our students for such a world? I mean, are we still thinking of music industries and creativity and all that? How do they survive in such a world?
No, it's essentially, this is exactly what I ask myself every day. You know, how do we prepare them? The fact is that they will survive. In most cases, the love of music, the love of the creative expression is so strong that it will find a way of actually, if more likely than not, it will be negotiating all of these uncertainties. It will involve, you know, teaching and performing and a lot of different things, but it will be there. So we need to prepare them for that. And that does include actually not trying to still paint a picture of the world as it was in the 80s and the 90s. That's my mission, you know, saying that, okay, hang on, guys, the world is a bit crazy right now, and it is unpredictable. I will give you two very interesting examples very soon, but you need to prepare for it. And if you prepare for it by learning new skills, by, you know, talking to other students, talking to other art forms, other disciplines, by exploring technology, by exploring communication, by understanding that the audience is still there, but it has changed, and it will change more. But there are ways of responding to this. The thing about the unpredictability, that's... I spend a lot of time reading about these things, and I'm really interested about that. And the other day I came across a very interesting fact. So, you're maybe familiar with a publication called The Economist, which is like still considered to be, one of the standards of journalism, one of the magazines that has survived, still producing. They come up with an edition every December. They come up with a thick thing, 200 pages, called The World Ahead. So next year. So The World Ahead in 2022 came out in December. I looked through the edition of The Economist, The World Ahead, that came out for Christmas 2019. Christmas 2019. The World Ahead in 2020. There isn't a single mention of COVID-19. Of course there isn't. Yet COVID-19 is the most defining. Whenever we think back about 2020, we will think about COVID-19. I looked at the edition that came out this December, Christmas 2021. Russia and Ukraine are not mentioned once. 6 weeks later, we are facing one of the biggest crises geopolitically in the world. This is how unpredictable the world is today in terms of even the best journalists who spend their lives looking, in the crystal ball. They can't see things that are happening 6 weeks. This is just facts, but we need to actually present this to our students, make this part of the conversation, and say that, hey guys, this is possibly not dangerous. It's simply the way the world is. And right now, it is volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous. Will it be more stable 40 years ahead? Perhaps, but we don't know. And if we keep telling students that, your symphony orchestra job is there, go for it. Your conservatories will always exist. Your audience will always like to hear Mozart played exactly the same way. And no, you shouldn't be listening to Coldplay because that's commercial. Well, that's not preparing the students for the reality that they're actually going to face. So this is my dilemma. How to do this within what is actually a very conservative, establishment of universities and conservatories and all of that, classical music. But it's doable. It's doable, and we're doing some progress in that. Cast.
I understand actually a more sense of panic, that maybe we should not even be concerned anymore with music or creativity or learning law, but we should put all our children in survival boot camps, right? Yeah.
The role of the artists that we are raising, are we raising?
Yeah.
Okay.
But
okay. So
this
then
exactly,
I maybe misunderstood you. Yeah.
But this is exactly why we need this pillar here. It's nurturing the questioning. I included discussing here. I included asking the why. This is exactly why we had to include this side of things.
And I agree with that, and I very much like that point that you're making. That if we're moving toward problem solving and to actually not going the paths that have already been set there, but actually creating new paths, that might also be a medicine against all these uncertainty and everything that could be on our path. Yeah,
I think so.
Point.
But
well, you said what is the role of that? For me, I was thinking a lot about it lately. We are reading Nassim Taleb's book Anti-Fragile, and yes, by defining for our students what their role will be, we put them into a place where they will never be able to fulfill it. I think we need to. They have to decide themselves what role they want to play in their society, because it's most likely soon not even my society anymore, right? Or 2070, I won't be around. I'm not planning to. So it's more for us to give them the tools that they can find what they want to be, right? And I totally agree with this. And if you want to be in a fragile world, you need to spread yourself wide, so that if one breaks off, you still have your other things. You need to have the flexibility to withstand shakes, right? You have to be earthquake safe, if you want to say so. And that's something that we definitely all also very much learned about over the last 2 years.
Thanks for that. It's very interesting. I'm conscious that the only people talking are the people who have already had their careers, so to speak. And I suppose I'm one of them. Two comments and a question. One is I personally think a lot of this is moderation of expectations. I've often only partly jokingly described music degrees as 4 years of controlled disillusionment. But I think part of the problem is that some of us are maybe unintentionally giving the idea of a 1950s financial model for music. In terms of the unstable world, I mean, I don't think there's any discussion about this. There is, of course, the profession of futurology, if you like, and I think most of the research shows that it's very easy to predict the future as an extrapolation from the present, but disruptive futures, disruptive technologies are the things that nobody has actually predicted, and if you did, you would make a lot of money. So a lot of what you're talking about here are the effects of the disruptive elements. The question, though, that I struggle with, and I think, is the business model for a lot of these, genuinely, because I think what you're sort of discussing in a erudite, interesting and imaginative way is what I suppose we all in the profession discuss to some extent. But the question is, where do we make money from these new disruptive things? I'm sort of conscious that I don't know some of these things on YouTube or Spotify, but as you know, you're probably from your own things, you can sell or have millions of listeners on Spotify and YouTube and make hardly any money at all. And there seems to be a genuine contradiction between, if you like, the exposure, the things that get us the most exposure give us the least money. There's a real contradiction. And the things that we want to make the money out of CDs or individual concerts, we'll actually get less exposure from. My answer is that we have to moderate our expectations. My own personal answer, that we're talking about portfolio careers like Bach and Mozart had. We had a very, I suppose, the standard repertoire period in classical music was a very short period, about 100 years, and it's ending now 100 years from about 1848 onwards. And so we're going back to the old idea that you earn a small amount of money, relatively speaking, out of a lot of different types of musical professions. But I'd love there to be another answer to this, and I don't know whether you have, and this is the question, for all these various ideas and observations, where do we which bits do we make money from? Assuming we're not in Germany with its sort of 82 opera houses and 100 odd professional.
137 orchestras.
Excuse me, yes, I'm constantly underestimating Germans. Yeah, I know. How do we make a living? I suppose is the question with these disruptive.
No, this is of course the $1 million question. But you know, the examples I showed you from YouTube, they are on YouTube for a reason. The artists on Spotify, they are there for a reason. And in fact, there is this myth that streaming won't give you money. It's not true. I used to spend quite a lot of time in copyright society governance, and I watched as this developed. Yes, back in the day, you could sell 10,000 copies of a jazz record, and that would give you royalties that were decent. It would sort of be, okay, you would break even. If you sold 15,000, it was really good. Anything above that, and same for classical. That's not true anymore. But if you do get on Spotify and a Spotify playlist, and you have as a jazz musician 2.5 million streams, which is not uncommon, then you actually make that sort of money. with that amount of streams, you actually start making money. It's not what it used to be, and it's like, remember, 2.5 million, or even beyond that. So the pyramid again is much smaller at the top. Less people are making money of this. The same with YouTube, but so the business model is there. Will this business model, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, will that be money generating in 5 years' time? More likely not. Something new will be there, which means that the music industry also needs to be constantly pivoting and finding. The classical music industry and jazz, which are like the small areas of music industry, they have found ways of monetizing this and surviving. But the German example is a very interesting one. As you say, it might be actually 82 operas, wouldn't surprise me, but at last count it was, how many? 86, yeah. At last count I had 137 symphony orchestras. Now, this is interesting because they have been merged. They haven't disappeared, but they are merged into slightly bigger. But that will change. What concerns me with a place like Germany is that now, suddenly, for the first time, they are going to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. This hasn't been part of the stable world that we've had before. This concerns me, because when big countries like Germany, and we could mention any other country actually that has this sort of thing, when they start using more money for defense because there is an unstable situation, that money will not come out of healthcare or education or schools. It is more likely to go out of things like culture. This creates a business model problem for the symphony orchestras, and for conservatories. And that worries me. The monetizing, not so much, because the audience is so big. It's just about finding a way of tapping into this. I can tell you Max Richter makes a lot of money out of these things. A lot. And so, but it's the publicly funded model that is likely to change, and this is concerning because we have based a lot on it. But this is a completely different discussion, yeah. Do we have time for another one?
We do.
I'm standing between you and dinner, which isn't good. Doesn't make me popular.
You'll be fine. I think we prepared that the dinner comes first.
So it's a fascinating discussion, and I think we could continue for hours over dinner. In Germany, it's beginning to happen. They've just cut all the staff funding for the DAAD, for the Humboldt Fellowships.
Really?
This for the coming year. So the world is changing even in Germany now. But I've found all this fascinating. I've got a number of questions, and I would love to talk to you more about this. But later, yes. How do we create what's going to give, what's going to be removed from the curriculum if we add all these fascinating, wonderful things? We all have only 24 hours in a day. That's one question. The other thing is, at the moment, we have specialists teaching this new generation of students in multiple competencies. But if they do that, they will not have this specialism to teach the new generation. So what is going to be the knock-on effect a generation later? That's a question that interests me very, very, very much. Yeah.
We will have generalists teaching, generalists. But remember that when I speak of generalists, to be a good generalist, you still need to be proficient at several things. So they are specialists. They could be specialists in many things, and not only, playing the piano or composing. And this is not uncommon. Kenneth, you refer to that as, the portfolio careers. That's another topic that could be interesting. But I'm not too concerned about that. But about your first question, because I think sort of the level of excellence still needs to be there. And as Christoph said, the skills still are very much part of that. Not in visual arts, though. And we've seen an interesting change there, where they are become, generalists almost to a too big degree. So they can shift from being sculptors to video artists, like from one project to another. But your first question is a really perhaps the interesting one to close on. What to take out of the curriculum? It's a perennial question. And I've been doing this job for many, many years. I've been through many, many curriculum changes. In any curriculum, there are a lot of courses that I would call pet projects, that one professor truly believed in some time ago, and this simply survived. We are very keen on putting new things, very bad at taking things out. But much of the answer to this is actually removing a lot of the stuff that has been accumulating over time, decluttering, and there are, believe me, even in our orchestra playing or be it in theory classes, there are ways of making these things much more relevant to students, because the biggest problem we have in conservatories today is that students are not connecting the lines or the dots in the curriculum. We think all the dots are really important, but that's not what's happening. So one of the reasons I'm bringing in Cast at Jeonsu-to Conservatory is because he is a line connector. Through improvisation, we connect a lot of the stuff around that, but we need to take something out in order to make it happen, but there is still a lot to be taken out. And interestingly, this isn't exactly the same discussion they are having in medicine and in law and in a lot of other courses, so it's not unique for us.
I actually have more questions, but I definitely will not put you in a difficult position as a new dean for these questions. But I have one hope that I think for Southeast Asia, if you're going to find an answer, this is a place, because I think we already intrinsically realize that change is certain. So this is a place that maybe we can discover these questions. And I'm tempted, like after all this experience for a few years, I have a feeling that I almost wanted to break a wheel in some way, following the Games of Thrones, that series is coming back. But maybe it's not the best way, that every time that we want to kind of like break the wheels, it's always cause so much devastating result, and possibly not the way. The third question I'd like to post here, not answering today, definitely, is the idea of maybe, like, I remember like when Thailand, the Thai government proposed the policy for 2030, we complained so much because we're saying that maybe the people of next generation wouldn't want to follow those kind of things. So it's a bit kind of like, for me, it's an ambiguity, whether when we're trying to figuring these things out, would our student be happy with the solution? But I think as an educator, we have to do this anyhow. So to just kind of like maybe provided some answers to them. And there's just one thing about you mentioned about reinventing, reimagining, recomposing. But the vocabulary that I like the most is decluttering. So maybe in Thailand we have been using for the last 10 years, and nothing has really been but I really like maybe it's the era of D. And then we can like decomposing, de-inventing, or de-imagining certain things, and then maybe our life will be easier. What do you think? What's your opinion? Or maybe we can discuss this over
I'm a positive person, so I'm more about recomposing because it's putting things together, whereas decomposing is taking them apart, So I like more the putting things together. I'm a composer, so I can't help it. But I get your point.
Let's do that.
Yeah. I think it presupposes decomposing to actually recompose.
Reconnecting. Decomposing, but reconnecting, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. So thank you very much. I think we can still continue this discussion in the next 2 days now. I'm really glad for the team, those next 2 days now. So thank you very much. Big applause to Professor Tornquist.